to set the stage, I guess we're talking about the real world, writing the real world versus uh, impossible or improbable worlds. And so, I guess an easy example of this, I think, would be, I think Mark tends to write in the real world. He writes stories that take place that are very real, no magic, no aliens, no nothing. I almost always write in improbable, if not impossible, worlds of science fiction or monsters or magic. Um, and there's a lot of questions that you could bring up relating to this. So, what are everyone's thoughts on that?
I'll start this week, this one, because I write both when I can, and in fact, even when I try to write the fantasy world, I try to bring it into the real world. So, but part of the question, if I remember when I read it, was also what do you think people enjoy more, or what's more saleable, etc. So, I mean. So let me take that in three parts. The first part is, from a writer's point of view, I've always felt like, adding some level of fantasy or mystery or et cetera, I find more creative, more challenging and freeing up. Again, trying to take, what you do in fantasy, et cetera, and make sure it's grounded. That's important to me. So I was watching something the other night, and there was I'm not going to go into it too much in detail, but there was a scene where there's all these improbable things because it was a fantasy kind of thing, right? And then there's a scene where the person is on his cell phone trying to be convinced that it's Sunday, not Friday, because they lost time and they don't believe it. And they have the cell phone right there, and then they put it down and they say to the waiter, "What day is this?" See, that's what I mean. If you're going to go into fantasy, remember, or science fiction instead, remember to ground the people into reality. The regular, mundane, everyday things are important. As for what people enjoy to read, et cetera, what might be more saleable, well, that, of course, it's personal taste. But also, I don't know, people talk about trends that when things are really bad, people look for escapism. That might be true. I don't know. I know personally, I think I do. The worse things get, the more I'm looking for light, easy, and escapist. But that's not always true. Some people like the cathartic of staying in that real world. So that's my take.
I tend to write about the real world most of my books, although obviously you've got to have some slightly not off the wall stuff happening, but you've got to have things that most of us never, come up against in life, like London gangsters or that kind of thing. But I've done one fantasy book, and it's never sold very well. I don't push it too hard because it seems that it's very much a genre that, well, I call it my Marmite book, which means you either love it or you loathe it. Marmite's a sort of beef paste that you get in a jar and you spread it on toast. You might well know it in Canada. Audrey, I don't know.
But I've heard of it.
Okay. And people either adore it or they hate it. So I've never really pushed it. I simply just went back to Fairyland, aka Disney or whatever, and thinking that probably Cinderella, being from the wrong side of the tracks, really should be getting a divorce from Prince Charles, who's terribly, terribly nice and, as gay as a two-bob note. But that's the only thing I have. I think people used to, in the Second World War, go and see these films in the cinemas that life was wonderful and it was set on plantations in the south of America, United States, and sort of go back and wish, or they watch them drive along the Corniche a lot, through Caen and Nice and these kind of things. But I think people are more grounded nowadays. I think they're not sort of taken in as easily. So if you're going to go to the fantasy route, you've got to go, I think, almost way over the top to the Star Wars thing where everybody runs around in black helmets or something. It's not my genre, so I'm not really up in it. But I think you've got to take them totally out of this world nowadays. It's just my thoughts.
I think your characters have to be realistic. I mean, even if they are in a fantasy setting, I think the reader has to be able to relate to the character So they have to, if they're, even if they're not human, the situations they're in, and the way the characters sort of make their decisions and how they relate to each other and all that has to be kind of something that the reader can identify with or have feelings about because they've experienced something like that. If it's too alien or too unrealistic, I think you're going to lose your character no matter what the setting is, or you're going to lose your reader, I mean, if they can't relate to the characters.
I agree with that.
Well, as Bertold said, I tend to write mostly in the real world. And this kind of gets into the next question about world building. But I remember when I was in my teens and 20s, I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction. I loved The Lord of the Rings, and I read Ursula Le Guin and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe books, and Anne McCaffrey's Dragon books, and Dune, and I mean, all these things. And the idea of creating a world or creating a improbable or impossible world and then having to come up with the rules of that world, I just kind of overwhelms me when it comes to the idea of trying to write something like that. That said, as Bertold knows, I think, I don't know if any of you read it, the Jump. Am I echoing? Does anybody else hear that?
It was a little bit. But
Okay.
Just a second, but I think it's okay.
Yeah. Okay. The Jump is a story that I started. I haven't finished, but it's basically, I would say it's either an improbable world or an impossible world. It's kind of a dystopian whatever about a future America where a president basically declares himself practically king and then, you know, does what he does. And one of the things I like about it is there are no rules. I can basically create anything that I want in this world where this guy has taken power and is just a remarkably narcissistic, and this wasn't meant to be a rumination on Donald Trump. But it's kind of interesting that, you know, trying to write a story basically where you can make up the rules, not have any rules, just kind of go with whatever, and it kind of opens the door to a lot more creativity.
Yeah, that's true. I think if you're making up a total world that doesn't exist until you've created, I think you have to think about it a lot. I mean, I've read articles that say everything you should think about is, you know, like kinship and the economy and the weather and the climate and the kind of animals you have. And I think you do need to think about all that stuff, but I don't think you need to trot it all out, sort of, especially right at the beginning. You don't have to kind of draw a picture of, this is the world the story is set in. I think you have to get right into the story and just bring out crucial details when they're needed. And as you go along, the reader should be able to build up an idea of what this world is like. Mind you, each reader will probably have their own version of it in their mind. But that's okay. I mean, that's always the way it is with readers. I think they see everything through their own lens, no matter what the writer has put out there. But as long as there's enough detail that's relevant, I think you're doing okay with the created world.
Am I right in saying that Tolkien actually wrote a whole language for his books afterwards? And
yeah, it was
a
based
little
on
before. He was a linguist, so yeah, he was actually most focused on that more than anything else, I think.
But was it just as far as the language went? I mean, he drew maps of where they went and that kind of thing.
He created
for these languages.
Yeah, he created alphabets and grammatical rules and things like that for the different languages, again, because that was his passion. Linguistics was his passion. And I think that was where the idea came from. You know, he started off with that as a kernel. Many things, of course, led them running the book, but that was part of it. The other was creating a mythology, you know, for England, basically, I think. So, yeah, linguistics was a big driver for him. And he really did put a lot of thought and consideration into that. So,
do we think he did this before or after he wrote the trilogy?
Yeah, from what I remember reading in an autobiography, before he started writing The Hobbit, he was playing around with the concept of an old, of a language, of creating an old language that didn't exist. And So, and that's why you see a lot of, his poetry in there is based on like Edda's type, is that the way it's pronounced? EDDA.
But it's so complex.
It
I mean,
is.
he had the as you read the Lord of the Rings stories, he keeps referring to the common speech, right? And all the hobbits' names and everything. But apparently that's supposed to be a translation from something else. And in the appendices, you can find references to what these guys' real names were in the language that wasn't translated. It's like it's a translation into English from this other language. And then, of course, it references the elves' languages and the dwarves' language and everything else. And they're all kind of different, but yeah, it's really, that floored me. When I saw that little footnote in the appendix about the translation, I thought, what? Really? And the Shire is really called Sousa or something? Like, how can that be? And I almost kind of thought, I'm just going to ignore it. And you can ignore that. You don't need to know it to enjoy the story. But, as you get into it and become a keener, to find out these kinds of details is like Easter eggs, right? You think, oh, wow, is that ever cool? So, yeah. But I don't know. I think that kind of has to be an organic thing that the writer develops as they create the world. I don't know that you can actually plan, I'm going to do it like this to this level of complexity ahead of time. Maybe some do. I don't know.
Well, it seems to me like with the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit that he had to do a lot of pre-writing effort on that, because it really is truly a completely different world. And with the languages, I can't imagine he just like sat down and started writing it one day. There was a lot that must have gone into it before he did.
There's a little story about he and C.S. Lewis where he got really annoyed with C.S. They were very good friends, as you know. He used to bounce some of the ideas off that before he finished writing, I should say, The Lord of the Rings. C.S. Lewis was putting out his That Hideous Strength book, and he mentions Numenor in there, which is one of the Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien was annoyed because he said, I haven't even finished, working all the details of that, and you're trying to tie it into something, and so yeah, there was a lot of effort that Tolkien put into those books way up front before they were ever fully completed, written and published.
Yeah. The second part of this question about what do we think sells better, has more appeal, I'm going to give the essential non-answer that I give to a lot of these questions. Well, it depends. Some readers like fantasy and science fiction, and the stories built and based in different worlds, and some others don't. I'm just trying to think, does anybody know if in the indie world are fantasy and science fiction genres that do well for indie writers?
They're very popular right now. That and psychological fiction seem to be, and the romance, which never goes away, seem to be the top selling. And a couple of long-term writers who've been doing Lee Chill, Jack Reacher type books have actually started doing psychological fiction recently, which I came across by chance. So yeah, they seem to be selling quite well at the moment. Well, I don't know. I mean, I can't say I'm making a fortune. I'm not.
Okay, I was just curious because I mean, I feel like, there are certain genres that do better in the indie world than others. And I mean, clearly literary fiction is not one of those. But I don't know about fantasy and science fiction.
They do quite well. There's certainly enough of them around, which makes you wonder, either writers are reading the stuff or seeing movies or TV things and wanting to create their own version of that genre, or they really do sell well. Or I don't know. I mean, don't ask me about selling. I'm not good at it. But my impression is that it's very popular both with readers and writers.
There's a lot of copycat stuff, though, isn't there? Something does well, like The Hobbit, and then all of a sudden we've got dozens and dozens of people churning out Hobbit clone type things with slight differences,
It's the Harry Potter and the Hunger Games produced how many more series that were similar in nature to them? Bertold, were you gonna?
Oh, just my impression, and I have no numbers whatsoever to back it up, is like in terms of selling, I feel like romance is the best bet for selling. Then sci-fi fantasy would be somewhat below that, but still okay. And I hate to say it, Mark, but I feel like literary fiction is the toughest one.
No, I know. I think, like Lucinda said, psychological fiction, courtroom, legal type or crime fiction, those might also do well too. But like I said, I've kind of lost track with science fiction and fantasy over the years, so I just don't have as much of a sense of how they do these days in indie or traditional publishing, because I just don't really pay that much attention to it.
But
Well,
you
my
know,
best
any of those genres can also can be done in a literary way.
Yeah.
I mean, look, Margaret Atwood, she's written science fiction, not fantasy, I don't think, but definitely science fiction. And her stuff is always considered literary because that's where she came from.
Yeah.
And so, if once you have sort of you're well known and you're thought of as a certain type of writer, you are kind of boxed in, but that doesn't mean you can't branch out. And even if you're not well known, like us, you can still, like Mark, you could write, if you wished, like that dystopia of yours. It's probably going to be sort of literary, even though it might even verge into something like science fiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it is possible you're not totally boxed into a little slot where you have to keep doing the genre the same way.
Yeah.
My best friend in high school, in fact, went on to become a partner of the oldest literary agency in London, in UK at least. And I said to her one day, well, literary stuff, it doesn't sell massively, does it? I mean, she had two Nobel Prize winners on her books that she handled, right? And she said, oh, well, they might not be selling like, Jack Reacher type stuff, and I can't think, my mind's gone blank, but, the well-known writers that we all know about that sell dozens and dozens of books. And she said, but they last longer. They're timeless. And she says, so if you really love your relatives, don't worry, write the books, and then they can get the royalties 2 generations down the road. Personally, I don't think she's right anymore, because they're now banning some really, really good books that have been classics because they're not politically correct anymore, and that's horrendous. But according to her, the literary things, they last, whereas everything else, like pop songs and that, very few of them really do last, stand the test of time.
So my great-grandchildren will see money based on my books?
Yeah, and you can look down on them on their mega yachts as they float across the Atlantic.
I'm not going to hold my breath for that. Are we done with this question? Are we ready to move on to the next, which is again somewhat related?
I think so.
How much detail to include in world building, from Suzanne at Mapping Uncertainty? And I'm just going to say I'm not the right person for this because I don't even include a lot of detail in my real world stories. I was thinking about this. The thing that I'm working on right now, which may be psychological fiction, Lucinda, depending on how I want to classify it. There's no indication of where the story takes place, city or anything else like that. It's basically, right now, it's just the action. There's very little backstory. There's very little detail description. It's just 40,000 words about what specifically happens between the characters. And I find myself doing that more and more these days. And when I finish the first draft, I'm actually going to go back and try to figure out if there's a way to include more detail and description, but I don't know if I'm going to do that. I'm going more and more in the direction of less description, less detail versus the other direction. So
I like this direction because I don't like description. I don't really like writing description. Since I write science fiction, one of the common pieces of advice that I hear is you're supposed to have a science fiction novel should be like 80,000 to 100,000 words because of all the world building you need to do. And you know, I tried to write a science fiction novel, and my target was 100,000 words. And even with all the world building and detail I could think of, I only made it, I think, about 65,000 because I was like, there's nothing else to say. I've told everybody everything I can think of about this world and about the characters. So I tend to lean very much on the side of do as little description as you can get away with. And it's better anyway because I think you can leave more stuff to the reader's imagination. Now, we do have the example of Tolkien that we were just talking about, and he has sold somewhat more books than me. So, and he was clearly big into world building. So I might not be the person to listen to on this, but like personally, my philosophy is, I mean, do some world building. My earliest books, as I've said many times, people were like, there's no description in these things. You have to have some kind of description. So have some, but don't go crazy. And basically, you know, don't, above all, don't add stuff just because you feel like, oh, I should add more stuff because I read it's supposed to be 80,000 words. Then it just, people will tell and it gets boring. So
yeah, I mean, I've always thought if you description and detail should be relevant to the story.
Mhm.
I mean, why does it matter if a river winds through the trees behind the property if the characters never actually go to the river that winds between the trees and back to the property? Like,
well, it's sort of like research. I know I read somewhere that you, depending on what you're writing, whether it's historical or there's some technology involved or something that you need to have to know about before you can write it, that what shows in the actual book should be about 1/10 of what the research you've done. It's like an iceberg, right? You're only going to see the relevant bits of it, but the writer still needs to absorb all that stuff so that when they produce the story, they've got the right sort of feel to it. You don't have kind of things missing or things outright wrong, but just because you've done all the research, you don't have to get all that stuff out there. So yeah, it's the essentials. It's you have to focus on what's happening with your characters, what they're like, and your plot, and there has to be enough action to move the thing along, and you throw in details about the world as you need them. So yeah.
It's a fine line, though, I find. If I write by the very popular, if I read a book by the very popular writers of the day, they are excellent in, you know, the guns that they use and how many rounds it will fire a minute. They don't go into great detail about it, but they will actually mention the kind of gun and the how many, where they got it from or where it was manufactured. And it seems to be so much more polished. And when I look at the fact she picked up a gun and fired, I'm thinking that's a bit amateurish on my part because I don't know what she picked up. It was just black and it had a trigger and she just went bang, bang, So I've actually tried, I'm starting to try now to be a little bit more, not detailed, but just give more information as a sort of backup to make it sound more authentic. Although I nearly did get thrown off Quora because I wanted to know, I could find out on the internet how to make a Molotov cocktail, but I wanted to know how far you could throw the damn thing. So I put up a question and I got an answer back saying, if you post this kind of question any longer, we're going to throw you out. I said, I'm very sorry, I'm just a miserable author. So I just had to sort of take a chance at it because I didn't want to say you could throw it 500 meters, which probably would make me a laughing stock. On the other hand, the guy couldn't get so close that he'd blow himself up at the same time. And it was over a 6-foot picket fence, it was just a bit tricky. So I sort of had to fudge it in the end, whereas if I'd been a bit more precise, I think it would have sounded a little bit more polished. But on the other hand, you don't want an office scene where you have the rundown of what clothes she wore every flipping day. I think it's probably more succinct to say she wore a smart business suit as she, as her high heels clattered across the reception floor or something like that. Will tell you a lot more than she had a white frilly blouse and a pink top and a purple skirt and all that sort of thing. That I think is very early type writing, the sort of thing that you'd put in.
So I just want to say one thing. It's interesting you brought up the gun, because in this piece I'm working on, there's a gun involved. And, my old fashioned view of guns is that they typically have 6 bullets in them, or a clip with 6 bullets in them. And then I was reading something a day or two. Oh, it's about the 2 guys who were posing as Secret Service agents. They had a handgun with 17 bullets in it. So now I have to decide, how many bullets does a gun have? So anyway.
I
Anybody?
tried to gather a few people around me. Like I've got a pet lawyer, and I've got a pet prison officer, and I've got a pet ex-constable, and I've got a pet. Anybody. The first thing when I meet them is, "What did you do in a former life?" "Oh, good. What can you tell me about whatever?" So I list them down as a possible expert to use in the future, because
Yes.
you can't always find everything out on the internet.
Yeah, I must admit, I had a couple firearms in one of my books, and I felt very uneasy about the whole thing. And really, what's the difference between a pistol and a revolver? And if you call something a rifle, what does that really mean? And I don't think I did justice to it. But after that, I didn't bother with firearms.
I like to answer this one too. When I read the question, I realized when you talk about world building, there's 2 ways to look at it. One is in the general world of fiction, and the other is specifically science fiction and fantasy. So I want to just do the 2 parts. And in the general fiction, I've always said story is king. And what is the purpose of your story? What is the emotion you're trying to evoke, or what is the analogy or allegory or whatever it is you're trying to do? What is your goal? And I was thinking, when I was thinking of the story, I thought, well, look, if you're putting on a play like Waiting for Godot, what do you really need but some chairs and people, right? Like sort of marketing. But if you're putting on Staging Camelot, you're going to need people in at least suits of armor. I mean, what is your intent in your story? Are you bringing people back to a time? So I was thinking about that. Think of historical fiction. Do you really just want to disperse with all the details if that is your point? All right, to immerse people into that time and era. So again, think of that. And then I think, as Audrey said, I think you hit right on it. You're going to do a wealth of research, but that doesn't mean all of that research needs to be brought in a story. So again, story is king or queen, story is leader. Focus on that, and then add as you need. Read through your paragraphs, read through your sections, and say, am I in that world? Am I in that space? What helps? What doesn't? What can I get rid of? And that's basic editing of your storyline. So that was the first. But then when you go into the worlds of fantasy and science fiction, there is really a more detailed concept of world building. All right. People spend hours with maps, which is kind of cool. I always got a kick out of that, but drawing their maps or creating magic, magic's however, how they're supposed to work, the whole mechanism. And I've heard or seen online, people get stuck there. Fiction writers, fantasy fiction writers saying how much detail, and they get stuck there. And I would say, let some of that go. Think about some of the greatest shorter stories. I mean, you could go get or again, put say a more television aspect. Think of Twilight Zone. Right? You didn't even have to know how things were working to get that story. So I would say, again, it's fun to do all of that and to get all of that in. But if you're writing in that fantasy world, it's okay to have things unexplained. Real world, we don't have everything explained. Right? And go look up quantum physics and have your mind blown. Okay. So I would say, get the basics down. If something doesn't seem right or contradictory, even your characters in your story, in your fantasy story can say, we don't know how that works, right? No one knows, but this is what we do. So that's just my take on it.
So in summary, I think we all agree that the story should drive the detail.
I guess that
better to under-explain things than to over-explain.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
before you, Bertolt, but the interesting thing about that is when you read some things that other writers or readers say, they want all the detail. they don't, like Bertold said, people complained that there wasn't enough description in his first, couple of stories. So I mean, I agree. I totally agree that the best thing to do is to leave things to the reader's imagination, that you don't have to explain everything. And if you do have to explain everything, it's going to be a story that is going to be a snoozer for a lot of people.
We have about 5 minutes left. I don't, is that enough to address the next one, or what do you?
I'd probably not, and we'd probably end up rushing and get cut off at the end.
And I feel like the next one is one we all are probably going to have a lot to say on.
Yeah. So why don't we end it here? And for anybody who's watching, we're towards the end of the questions we got on the blog back in January. So if other writers out there listening to this, watching it, have questions they'd like us to address, put it in the comments or send an email to us, and we'll address them in future chats. Is there anything else anybody has?
I want to correct a mistake I made at the beginning, which was I forgot to mention the first question we addressed in this chat came from Anonymol. I forgot to say the name, but it was Anonymol. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
I wanted to say it to Marks, for those who are on Twitter, you can contact via Twitter as well. At least
Yeah.
that's where I live.
Our Twitter is what? WSW 2021, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Audrey, Lucinda.
No, that's it.
I think so, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Everybody have a good week.
Yes, you
You have
too.
a good week too.
You too.
Thank
Good
you.
to talk to you all. Take care.
Okay.